Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Intelligence Spotlight series. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Adams, a highly accomplished national security expert and former CIA targeting officer. Sarah's remarkable career includes leading counterterrorism efforts with a specific focus on the Taliban, Afghanistan, and Al Qaeda. She has provided critical intel into these groups, networks, and activities, contributing to the United States strategic response to terrorism in the region. Sarah also advised the U.S. House Select Committee on Benghazi and co authored the book Benghazi No Thai Enemy, which is a comprehensive investigation into the September 11, 2012 attacks on the U.S. consulate and the CIA annex in the Benghazi in Libya. The book, which was authored by former CIA officers like Sarah herself and Dave Benton, provides a detailed account of the events that happened, identifying the perpetrators and analyzing the broader implications for the U.S. national security. We're very honored to have her with us today. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. The first question might be a very unexpected one. What subjects were you good at during your high schools and why?
Oh gosh, what was I good at? I was always like decent at everything, but not great at anything. I found things like history really interesting, but to be really honest, I wasn't an academic. I like the sports and stuff like that the most.
Okay, I think that also the subjects we do have. So sports, okay, sounds good. All right, and let's just jump straight to your work and talk about your time as the CIA targeting officer. What exactly does role actually do? Does it collect, identify, analyze the information to mitigate the risks or the target you target a threat that emerges, especially when you were stationed in Pakistan, right? How much you relied on open source intelligence, for example. And from my understanding, I think without OSINT, confidential intels usually also need to be corroborated in a way with OSINT, right?
Correct. Yeah. So just as quick background, when I got hired into the CIA, I was hired as an analyst at first. And then I had told my boss right away that I thought I was hired into the wrong part of the agency. I saw myself in operations. And so it was basically my second week in the agency. And he put me into the role as a targeting officer. So I'm one of the rare people that went through like the CIA's career analyst program and their targeting officer certification course because they're in different directorates at the CIA. So I did both. So really, the targeting is very simple. It was something designed at a time, and we used to call it Alex Station when we started doing counterterrorism operations. And remember, we had analysts and then we had case officers who went on and collected information, but there wasn't some person in between, right, to help support the case officer because the analysts have to spend a lot of time, as you know, researching, analyzing, and then writing reports for policymakers. So they didn't have time to do operations. So it was like people started filling that void. And then one day they're like, oh, wow, this is a profession. Let's make it real. Let's make a training program. Let's hire people into it. And that's how that came about. Now, your question about when I worked Pakistan, was OSINT valuable? It actually was because the first group I focused on was Lashkar-e Jhangvi. And at the time, it wasn't a priority to the US government. So the US government hadn't been collecting on it pretty much ever. So I honestly started the whole project into the group completely unclassified. Even when I wrote my first paper on it, it was actually fully classified. And my boss made a joke that I couldn't release the paper inside the CIA completely unclassified, right? It would look bad because I use no classified sources. So yeah, I leaned in heavily. And you don't always have that at the CIA, right? Because sometimes it's hard to access unclassified information. So it ebbs and flows inside the CIA, how often it gets used and how easily you can pull it into your work product and use it.
Precisely. Yeah, there are always this need for OSINT, open source in many areas, unless if there's, I think, could be like case to case, it's different. Some cases may need only OSINT information, but some cases might need both, and some only relies on the classified ones, I believe. But also, I think precision is very important. It was very important in your work too, right?
Yeah, of course, precision is important, but another thing that's really valuable when you're overseas is having information that you can discuss and share with the foreign government too. So sometimes you don't really want to use the most exquisite collection you have, right? Because if you can just only look at it in your office and you can't share and discuss and collaborate with others, it doesn't really benefit anyone for three people to know a piece of information. So I was always pretty for leaning on using more readily available information because I did think it was valuable to work with other partners. And those partners aren't just that local government, but all the other governments at the embassies, right, in your area, because they're all force multipliers for your work.
Exactly. Let's move to the main topic that we have today about the Taliban. We see there are changes that happen after the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan, and particularly what changes have you observed post-Taliban takeover in area of intelligence gathering, for instance, and which countries do you think are more involved and what they're really looking for? And do you think India and Pakistan have active intelligence operations inside Afghanistan against each other somehow?
Yeah. First, when you talk about US intelligence collection, it was our own general from CENTCOM who said we lost 98 to 99% of intelligence collection, which any layman can understand. That means the information right now we're getting out of Afghanistan, we're relying 98 to 99% on the Taliban, right? That's very scary. I have major concerns with the US's intelligence collection out of there. And as you can imagine, all the actors are playing in the intelligence sphere inside Afghanistan for multiple reasons, right? China's involved for numerous things. They have economic interests. They still are collecting against different terrorist groups that they're concerned about, obviously. And then the Russians are involved. They got a lot more heavily involved after the Moscow attacks, but we just saw this visit by Shogu yesterday, right? So they're leaning in heavily. And that's not even the first time. Like about a week ago, there was Russians in uniform in country, right? So that was definitely one of the first visit. India, of course, is very involved. India has a de facto consulate they're running out of Kandahar, which I think is a lot of their intelligence operations. Pakistan, of course, has always been involved. Pakistan has a much more complicated situation, right? Because they have these historic ties, but then now all their historic ties, those people are turning on them and they're basically funding, supporting, and arming both the Taliban Pakistan, TTP, and then the Baluchistan Liberation Army, the BLA, which is Pakistan's two biggest problems, besides the Imran Khan issue going on in the capital. And
Hmm.
however, others like the Red Mosque people are going to take advantage of that and stuff. So Pakistan has a lot they're having to deal with, besides just the fact that Pakistan also does some support, right? Going the India direction.
Right.
And some of that does come from Afghanistan, a little bit of the ISKP stuff or some of the Al Qaeda Indo subcontinent, right? So there's a lot of different actors playing in the region. And then one that's never really discussed, but they're having the most impact is Iran, right? Iran has really evolved and back in the day, they had their proxies, but they were like nobody super serious, right? It was Sipper Isa Habas, Pakistan and whatnot. But now Iran has like Al Qaeda working as proxies. Taliban does proxy work for them. And that's getting really dangerous, right? To put these type of actors together and have them like cross collaborate on attacks because it makes them more
Yeah.
impactful.
Yeah. I think it's crucial to understand how all these different countries are using Afghanistan for their own national security and benefits in different ways. But it's also important to take a step back and look at the history here, right? Just to set stage for the audience that and about Al Qaeda's background, and in this case too. So I was reading that during the Clinton administration, Pakistan was actually flagged as a state sponsor of international terrorism, right? So why? It was because they were running training camps for Kashmiri guerrillas on their own soil, right? But then, of course, pressure and lobbies from India made Pakistan to somehow deal with with this situation. But they actually did not shut down these camps, right? What they just did was to move them across the border into Afghanistan. And I think here is where it gets really interesting. Those areas in eastern Afghanistan were already strongholds of the Haqqani network because of their fight against the Soviets. in the 80s, and then moving these camps there set the stage for what would later become the Al Qaeda's heartland. And now, around the same time, that new group emerged from there, Harakat al Ansar, which took up the mantle of regional militant operations. And then you've got bin Laden there coming back from Sudan in the 90s. And then what Pakistan does here is Pakistan basically hand over some of these training camps to bin Laden in places like Homs and Nangarhar, if I'm right. And then these camps somehow became the backbone of the Al Qaeda's growth, usually for training, for different ideologies, and also recruitment because they were coming from different areas as well, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. And then operatives were also trained there, and somehow that's how the network expanded. So of course, it was with direct support of bin Laden and the Pakistani establishment. So what you see here is a clear convergence, right, of state policies, militant networks, and regional alliances, all feeding into this rise of Al Qaeda, which became real powerful later. So coming back today, what changed in the militancy dynamics in the region, especially post-US withdrawal from Afghanistan? Who inspired them and provide them logistical support? Basically, who do you think is the head of the snake here?
Yeah, in my opinion, there's three heads of the snake, right? It's Mullah Yaqub, who's the head of the Taliban military. It's Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's the Minister of Interior in Afghanistan, and it's Hamza bin Laden, who runs Al Qaeda. The three of them work closely together. They're all related now through marriage, right? And you can't focus on one without the other, right? Because they all make a piece of this puzzle work and they all collaborate. And as you said, they're the ones fueling the militancy. They're the ones allowing all the training camps to come in. They're the ones allowing all the new foreign fighters to come in. They're the ones pushing the collaboration between the groups. Like the groups are coming together because these three people have the power to do it. And look at who they are, right? You have Osama bin Laden's son. You have
Mhm.
Jalaluddin Haqqani's son, and you have Mullah Omar's son. If you don't have that trifecta is the most powerful militant alliance in the entire world. There is no other terrorist in the world, if you lump them together like that, besides maybe Qasem Soleimani when he was alive, who can really inspire and bring in the talent the terrorists need to bring in. And that's the craziest part, right? We've seen terrorists that you just thought they're completely done or off the grid or past their time. I'm really good examples of Al Qaeda a few months ago named Yassin al Suri. They're heading Gaza and he moved in there. So also all the old Al Qaeda guys are inspired and they're back and they're excited for the second generation of leadership. And they want to be a lot more aggressive. Hamza bin Laden is not his father. He is much more aggressive. And it's something we really need to be worried about because Osama was calm, patient. He thought through things, and Hamza's not that way. Hamza is very operationally focused. He's very aggressive, and he's willing to take risks his father never would have taken.
And I guess Hamza bin Laden in this case also benefits from his non-Afghan blood, meaning that usually the Afghan blood is usually easier to boil and sometimes leads to irrational decisions among, let's say, the Taliban. So do you think Hamza bin Laden brings in more pragmatic approach and strategy?
Well, it's interesting. So if you ask Iran thinks he is a little hot-headed. He's a little
Mhm.
aggressive, and that's why they spend more time working with and aligning with Saif al-Adil because they think Saif al-Adil is more of a cool customer. He's got the strong Egyptian roots, and they actually find that they're a little more they respect that a little more. So it's interesting that the preference isn't what Hamza is, but that is going to be the future probably of the second generation.
That's quite interesting to know that. And how do they just generally the global jihadi groups, despite being different in ideologies sometimes, especially when it comes to ISKP, the Taliban, or other groups, they do have some ideological differences with different agendas, but there seems to be a connection among them all. Something connects them, right? Whether that comes to operational support, maybe logistical or financial. And a while ago, you also said that Abu Ubaidah, the Hamas, and also other members of Hamas military wing, especially, did travel to Afghanistan prior to the October 7 attacks. How does that even work? Was Iran facilitating it?
Yeah, we actually wrote a whole report on this. Actually, it's a little confusing for people because everybody calls it the Hamas attacks, but that attack on October 7th was planned by IRGC. They're actually their intelligence organization. A lot of people assume it's the Quds Force. It's not. Al Qaeda, the senior leadership of the Taliban, and Hamas, right? So all four groups were involved. So a big chunk of the plotting actually occurred inside Afghanistan. And then about a third of the attackers got trained inside of Afghanistan. So about 500 of them. They were about between 5 and 6 different camps, but we found 11 locations they were at prior to October 7th. And then the interesting part is Abu Ubaidah came to oversee some of that training as almost like a partnership, right? Thank you, Taliban and Al Qaeda, for doing this with us. But yes, it was mostly facilitated by a terrorist in Iran. His name is Mohammed Kazemi. He's a really interesting character. He was one of the really close IRGC guys to Soleimani. When Soleimani died, he moved up. He didn't move up in the Quds Force. He took over IRGC IO. But when Soleimani was alive, Kazemi was the one responsible for harboring Hamza bin Laden, Saif al-Adil, and then the terrorist we talk about, Musa bin Ali, the Libyan, who we focus on and where we get most of this information from being around, looking into what he's involved in. But that's where that relationship comes. It's a historic relationship, and that's why they trust him because he kept them safe in Iran.
Regarding Iran and their proxies, I think for a lot of people prior to the October 7 attacks, it was a bit difficult to understand that Iran could be approaching proxies or creating proxies that are not Shia Muslims as well. There was a shift because Iran was only focused on creating Shia based proxy networks like the Fatimiyun, consisting of migrants from Afghanistan, or the ones the others in Iraq, and as well as in Syria, and the biggest one of them, Hezbollah. All of them were Shia, but then we see suddenly the connection with Hamas, and then the major attacks, and then also the claims of, okay, Iran is actually helping Al Qaeda. That's a wild claim in a way for a lot of people, and it's hardly digestible. So what do you think? Why is Iran doing that? Is it something beyond the Shia ideological spectrum?
It's just because the relationship formed when all the so remember, when the US went into Afghanistan, it didn't really become a war with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda went to Pakistan and Al Qaeda went to Iran, right? And made relationships in those countries, right? They were more successful making
Mhm.
relationships in Iran because in Pakistan, the Pakistanis were willing to capture Al Qaeda. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is a really great example. So it made the senior leaders want to go to Iran. Think about it. If you're in Iran with your wife and your children, you are going to make really good relationships with the government because you have to trust them now to keep you safe, keep your family safe. And very close relationships were formed between those groups, and people really get lost in this. And then I think a lot of it really got cemented in Syria, right?
Mhm.
Terrorists really became aware who are really our enemies, right? Our enemies are basically the US government and the Russian government or whatever assessments made. And they're like, why are we fighting with each other? Why is this a Sunni Shia thing? And that was always Osama bin Laden's thing. I don't want my people attacking Shia, and he would lecture some of the groups they partner with for doing it. And
Right.
Hamza feels that way completely. Hamza would never agree. He does not want an Al Qaeda. He wants to attack Shia. And Hamza now, in the last few years, has created the Islamic Army, right? And the Islamic Army is Sunni Shia. There is no preference of being one or the other. You could be either and be a part of the Islamic Army. And the Islamic Army is headed by Hamza al Gandhi, and he's having a lot of success in that. A lot of the fighters Al Qaeda sent into Syria, to Mali, to Burkina Faso, to Somalia, they're actually trained and under the Islamic Army banner. And so there's all these people saying, oh, there's this growth in ISIS in Syria, or there's this growth in Al Shabaab in Somalia. No, this is Islamic Army. Like, you're behind the curve. These groups have come together and they're powerful, and this is all Hamza bin Laden doing in honor of his father.
That's quite interesting to hear that. And I think I was reading this book the other day and finished it. It's written by the British former journalist and author David Lloyd. The book is called Butcher and Bull. So it actually talks about all the different militant movements and political changes in Afghanistan from the first Afghan Anglo War up until recent. There was this part that was interesting for me, and it was about the US rule and the US administration, how it actually created its own enemy in a way. And I quote page 265 that the US administration played its part in creating the bin Laden brand, blaming him for involvement in a long list of attacks going back to the death of 18 servicemen in Mogadishu in 1993, although some officials would admit that there was little evidence for much of this. So, how do you make of it?
I don't really think that's true the way that's written. I don't think Bin Laden was created as a boogeyman. I do think there was intelligence and information. And as you saw, the US actually didn't take him very seriously as a boogeyman. Even Clinton himself didn't do the operation against Bin Laden. And then 9/11 happened. Now, if you want to talk about terrorists that were made into boogeyman, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is the one that was able to take advantage, right? He was this low level guy in Iraq and he became the main target because we had this war there.
Mm.
And really, it wasn't originally in a war against Al Qaeda. They weren't involved in 9/11, right? But he became that. We gave him the power, right? We made him important. And that ended up until the fall of Kabul. That was probably the greatest surge ever of terrorists, new terrorists, recruits, fighters being trained, etc. And so I think that was a huge policy failure.
True, I do agree with that. And also, some there's some groups from Afghanistan who are still there and they are not part of the Taliban, but people actually don't know about their past allegiances. Hekmatyar, for example. Hekmatyar, I think he wanted to fight for Al Qaeda back in the days. And how much do you know about him? And what do you think that does he still maintain his relationship with Al Qaeda? Because in 2006, he actually uh, announced that he would fight under the banner of Al Qaeda against the occupying force of NATO and also the Afghan government back then.
So the way I look at Hekmatyar is really interesting. It's similar to the way I look at Libyans. So a lot of Libyans went to Afghanistan, right? But they didn't exactly, let's say, join Al Qaeda. They fell under like a Hekmatyar and Abu Iqlis earlier in the days, or they would just make up their own group, right? Like the
Right.
Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. They did the same thing during the Libyan Revolution. So thousands of Al Qaeda members went in and fought in the Libyan Revolution. They didn't fight as Al Qaeda, they fought under these different martyrs groups and whatnot, right? There are terrorists who don't want to plant their flag in the sand because they have their own identity. The Libyans are that way, and I think Hekmatyar is that way. And I think he's that way because it benefits him, right? He likes to play both sides. He likes to manipulate the situation. So the way I look at him is he's an opportunist. He's a terrorist, but an opportunist, and he will make the play that works best for him now. And next month he'll make a play that works best for him then, right? That's the way he cares about himself. And really that's the way we should look at him. Now, at the age he's getting to be, right? He's less of a player. The second generation is where the power is. He's more of a relic. So that's more the way I look at him. I don't really see him as the mover and shaker. And to be honest, in the senior meetings, he's not in them, right? So
Mhm.
even the terrorists are viewing him as a value added right now.
I see. Yeah, it was interesting also in during the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan that when different groups emerged to fight the Soviets, actually the Hikmatyar group had received way more financial support from US from other countries. It was more than 500 million in total, like, compared to other groups, Al Masood, for instance, or Northern Alliance. And though I see him as also a survivalist somehow, that would
Hmm.
try to survive throughout all these different regime changes. Even later, he made a peace deal with the U.S. backed government of Afghanistan, which he was fighting against. It's interesting. So there is
You know
another.
who's always a lot like him? Suraj ad-Din Haqqani is a lot like Hekmatyar. He doesn't get the credit for playing every
Mm,
side, manipulating every situation,
right,
taking
right.
money from friends and foes. but he is like the new generation of Hekmatyar.
And I guess it also relates to that article of the New York Times, right? It portrays Haqqani as a more pragmatist, a person that actually can govern, and also tells you that, okay, Haqqanis know how to deal with foreign uh, engagement or how to engage with foreign countries. And at the same time, it portrays the Mullah Yaqub and other factions as more fanatics, religious fanatics in extreme form. But also, I think they do have that extremist wing and in the Haqqanis. But for me, from my understanding, is that I think they are the brains of the Taliban at the moment, and they can pull the strings far better than the Kandahari factions, for instance, right?
I actually think, first off, I think that piece in the New York Times was propaganda. It was the
Mm,
second pro Siraj Haqqani piece in the last 4 or 5 years. And it's very dishonest. So
mm,
the thing is, Siraj ad-Din Haqqani is the deal maker, right? But Mullah Yaqub is very intelligent, and Hibatullah Akhundzada doesn't get any credit. But him and Siraj ad-Din Haqqani are in contact all the time via Telegram, right? So
mm.
if you think some of these decisions aren't being made by Hibatullah, then you're falling for their propaganda, right? And I really think that's a big problem. People are like, oh, the Haqqani faction and the Kandaharis. No, there is an Al Qaeda Taliban. Hibatullah supports it. Mullah Yaqub supports it. Siraj ad-Din Haqqani supports it, right? To act like there's this huge split in the Taliban is what they want you to think and they want you to focus on. So when they meet with these foreign governments, they can waste an hour of their time talking about, oh, these splits in the Taliban and, oh, well, someone's trying to, Hibatullah is worried about being assassinated and blah, blah, blah. And the people write up these reports and then they spend all their time talking about it and don't discuss the real issues that they're all working together. They're
Mhm.
terrorists, they're planning attacks in multiple countries. So they're letting you focus on the political side of things and they're playing like the whole world with that. So I think a lot of that's crap.
That's a way to put it because it's always about the bigger picture, right? It's a strategy. You create a fog for people to get busy with while you do your own thing, and it's been a common tactic. And unfortunately, a lot of people cannot see it through that fog. And I was also reading,
And they're all intermarried, right? Remember, the
yeah,
Kandahari Taliban is now married to the Haqqanis. They're married to Al Qaeda. So for anyone to be like
yeah,
one smarter than the other, they're all married. So they're either all dumb or they're all smart because they're all blood.
yeah. And tribal codes also play an important part because if you're married to someone, it's part of your blood, so you cannot stick out of them. So you gotta stay together no matter what. And I guess that relates to other thing that you've been warning. You've been writing a lot that okay, the U.S. politicians do not pay attention to it, and that something is cooking up in Afghanistan at the moment, and potentially bigger, a very broad attack similar to 9/11 or maybe different in 2025. Right? What do you mean by it?
Yeah. It's
And,
a series. It's a
and what is
series.
it
Oh, sorry.
being neglected here? Who doesn't pay attention to it? And what do you think? What will happen exactly?
Yeah, it's a series of attacks, right?
Right.
It was supposed to start in 2022. It got pushed to 2023. It was October 7th, but that was supposed to occur October 7th, 2022. So
Mhm.
it's a series that are all planned out. Some are approved and not approved, right? But it starts with the Israel attack. It goes with a bunch of US embassy attacks. And then it culminates, at least that phase, with attacks on the US, a large attack like Israel, and an attack on Europe, right? And then once all that's successful, they move to other regions, one being India. So that's more probably 2026, 2027, right? So it is a long-term plan that they have, and they're just going now down each piece of the plan. But because the Western intelligence community missed the first piece, right?
Mm.
The Israeli attacks, they lost the entire plan because that's when everything else was being planned. So they're behind the curve in all the planning. And now a lot of the planning has become operational. And so that's my argument. Hey, we've missed the boat. They have trained and deployed the homeland attackers, at least coming to the United States. The attackers are in Europe now, right? So you're behind the
Mm.
curve. So you're going to be responding to attack more likely than thwarting an attack. And that's not where we want to be as counterterrorism professionals.
So do you think it might be because of the US and general the Western countries' involvement with war in Ukraine and they put a lot of resources in that area and also trying to fight Iranian proxies in the Middle East? Is that because of that they might neglect it, or is just it's not on the table at all?
I think at the fall of Kabul, they launched the intelligence collection, and
Hmm.
then they did shift the resources to Ukraine and never refocused on counterterrorism. And they don't want to focus on counterterrorism. They're moving on to the next war, and that's not even Russia, right? The focus is China. So instead of like deliberately focusing on each enemy and putting the right resources against each enemy, they're like, okay, for the next 5 years, this is our enemy, and we're going to lump most of our resources towards them. And I think it's a huge failure.
A while ago, there were reports of CIA meetings with the Taliban as well in Doha, if you remember. And
Mhm.
primarily, from what I know, is that a lot of these meetings are based in countering ISKP. Or do you think it's still that could be that fog that trying to tell to the media?
Yeah, so that's what the relationship is based on. Basically, what the Taliban does is they meet with the US government and they provide info on ISKP and sometimes on Al Qaeda's Indo subcontinent. It's bits and pieces. It's not useful. They lie. Like they say ISKP is eradicated from Afghanistan when there's 3,000 fighters just in Konar, right? And then the Taliban sadly kill Afghans, a lot of Salafis, or just other random people that they are enemies with, like kill like musicians, for example, and different activists. And then they go to that relationship with the US government and say, hey, we killed 5 ISKP terrorists. Nobody goes and checks it. I don't know if you remember, even around the time of Abbey Gate, I know there's the really famous USAID bombing, but remember there was a completely separate bombing in Nangarhar, and we were told we got 2 senior ISKP people. It's been 3 years. Who were they? Finished,
Hmm.
right? Because the
Right.
Taliban has been providing misinformation even within, what was it, 6 or 7 months after Abbey Gate. They lied to the US government saying they got Sana Lugafari. Sana Lugafari is very alive and well. Heck, he lives half the time in Sirajudeen Haqqani's guest house, right? It was a lie at the time. Nobody went back and reversed it. So they've been doing this. They've been feeding misinformation to the government, and the terrorists are actually exploiting it and putting other information in and feeding it. So yeah, there's a whole ruse around
Mm.
ISKP. Al Qaeda is meeting directly with ISKP, and so are the Haqqanis, and they do have a collaborative relationship.
But what do you make of some of these other attacks against the Taliban positions or the attacks, particularly some of the key Taliban governors who were killed in places like Badakhshan or in Balkh? They were assassinated and later they were claimed by ISKP. Do you think ISKP is just a mere project of the Taliban and Al Qaeda to have a leverage over the US and or the Western countries to say, okay, we're fighting it for you? Or do you think could be actually there are some isolated incidents that could not be coordinated in advance?
Here's the deal. ISKP came out of the fact that at the time, the Afghan military really messed up some
Hmm.
operations they did in Pakistan. And some of the militants they thought they were aligning with, they bombed them. And those people became ISKP. So ISKP was first formed because of a break in a relationship with the Afghan government at the time who was supporting them, right? So that's where it started. Now, it came out of Iraq side Pakistan. It was a lot of Pakistanis. It only shifted to this Afghan focus when Sana Ullah Ghaffari took over it. But what people don't remember, Sana Ullah Ghaffari was the head of the Haqqani network in Kabul when he
Mm.
took over ISKP. So yes, the original ISKP was slightly different, but it's evolved now because of this Haqqani influence and it's stronger. But what a lot of people don't know is there's two branches of ISKP, right?
Mm.
There's the Sana Ula Ghaffari one. We all know it's the most famous one, which it shouldn't be the most famous one. And then the second one is the Gulmurad Halimov one.
Mm.
That's the one based in Takur and Badakhshan. He is the ISIS minister of war, and it
Mm.
gets ignored. And then people are confused, right? Because that's where a lot of the Central Asian terrorists join. And then the one we all talk about again is a lot more of the Iraq side guys, Punjabi guys, etc. So there is not an understanding in that community, even of ISKP. And then they give examples. This guy got killed by them. He got killed because there was a problem within their relationship, right? That's what happens. You end up dead. They're terrorists. And then they're like, oh no, that means ISKP is against the Taliban or Al Qaeda and they're fighting them. And it's a lot of misinformation and just a lot of not an understanding of what's really happening on the ground.
In a way, they all planning something. And what you said, that there are series of attacks. It's not just one. So that series of attacks could be in a way to not raise alarms for the people that may come against them as well, like the US? Or is it just a new strategy they want to implement?
Yeah. The way I look at it, they're waves of attacks. They're waves because of how long it takes to train, deploy,
Right.
prepare. But to do the other piece you're talking about is yes, Al Qaeda does not want Americans coming and bombing their camps. So the next wave of attacks, the first wave was blamed on Hamas. The next wave attacks are going to be blamed on ISIS, Khorasan province. So then the US government goes to the Taliban to deal with it. And that's the plan. So yeah, Al Qaeda is going to have a hidden hand. Iran does in their attack. So they're playing like the proxy card. So yeah, there is no intent to claim that Al Qaeda did these attacks once they're complete.
Mhm.
Like they never claimed October 7th, even though they were directly involved.
And regarding the Trump presidency, I'm sure a lot changed, a lot were discussed that, okay, Trump may fight the Taliban or may topple the Taliban. And some said, no, actually, he wants to engage with them. And what do you think actually would change under the Trump presidency when he takes office next year and dealing with the Taliban? Also, a while ago, Zalmay Khalilzad, he said that the time has come to fully implement the Doha Agreement. What he means by that?
Yeah. The problem is Khalilzad is a Republican, right? A very wealthy Republican. And unless he's pushed aside, I'm not seeing a huge change in the US government relationship. Yes, luckily, a lot of veterans have made noise about the financial support to the Taliban in this growing terrorism. But we don't even hear any of these new admin officials coming in and really talking about it in a way that there's something pragmatic, right? So unfortunately, the way I look at it, I think it's going to be status quo for a little bit until maybe the US gets attacked. Is it probably at an embassy? And hopefully then policy changes. But unfortunately, I don't think Afghanistan's a top priority of the new administration. And I do think it's going to go to the back burner until someone's forced to make a decision on it.
But here's an interesting thing about Trump. When the US withdrawal happened, he was really angry that we should have maintained a number of troops in Afghanistan. It was in 2021 that he mentioned. And then later in November 2023, which was last year, he said that we should engage with the Taliban. If I become a president, I would engage, I will negotiate to take back the Bagram airfield. So my question on that is that will there be further isolation of the Taliban, or that Trump might really go and engage with them like he said last year? Because I believe that he would negotiate to Taliban to get back the Bagram air base because of countering the Chinese influence. Do you think that would happen? If not, or that was just a statement after all?
The only way we're taking Bagram back is by force. And you and I both know you cannot make a negotiation with the Taliban for Bagram. So if people really believe that they're lying, right? Remember, our Secretary of State is going to be Marco Rubio. He has not really said anything about engaging with the Taliban, continuing relationships, not. There's definitely no war planning going on for taking Bagram. So we have to remember some of this is rhetoric, right? Unfortunately, I really think it's going to be, and the situation's going to happen, and a decision's going to have to be made. Now, I do think Trump is a deal maker, and I do think he's upset with the Doha deal, and I do think there's an likelihood the Doha deal might be ended. But does that mean everyone's going to step up and end every other thing that's been going on with the Doha deal, like the humanitarian dollars that were involved? I just don't see it. I don't know if you remember, but it was maybe like 5 months ago, Nancy Mace, she's in Congress, she wrote a bill to designate the Taliban a terrorist organization, and her own party pushed back on her, the Republican Party. There isn't even support in the Republican Party to designate the Taliban a terrorist group, right? And remember, we're going to need a lot of these things to be acts of Congress. So it's not just one person coming in at the helm, right? There needs to be a lot of people involved in this effort against Taliban. And I'm just not seeing the type of support you need to make the massive changes that have to occur.
Sarah, thank you so much for being at the Intelligence Spotlight series. It was truly great to have you, and it was very important that we should light and especially to hear your thoughts on what's happening in that region. It was very informative. Thank you again.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.